On the 12th of August 2000, the Russian Navy held its most massive naval exercise since the fall of the Soviet Union. Due to a technical error, the unsinkable Russian submarine, the Kursk, it sank. It amounted to a disaster in which the submarine was subject to 2 enormous explosions, killing all 118 crew on board. In the chaos of the aftermath of the blast, Vladimir Putin, who had recently become president of Russia, faced one of his largest political crises as of yet. In 1992, the construction of the submarine that would become the Kursk started. 2 years later, in 1994, the submarine was completed and officially launched in the Barents Sea. In the true spirit of Russian tradition, it was baptized by an Orthodox priest. As for the technical details of the submarine, it was the last of the Oscar II class submarines, of which the design stemmed from the era of the Soviet Union. The submarine was 150 meters long and 18 meters in width, making it one of the largest attack submarines ever built. The only submarines that were larger were the Typhoon class submarines. Due to the submarine having double-plated hulls, it was deemed unsinkable. The outer hull was an 8.5 millimeter steel plate resistant to oxidation and corrosion. Due to the weak magnetic field of high alloy steel, the Magnetic Anomaly Detection systems from the United States would have difficulty detecting the submarine. The inner hull was 50 millimeters thick, with a space of 2 meters between the outer and inner hull. Furthermore, there were 2 nuclear reactors on board and 4 torpedo tubes. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Russian Northern Fleet lost a lot of financing, which meant the fleet was reduced in size quite a bit. Furthermore, sailors often went months without salary and food was only occasionally present. This too was the case for Russian submarines that were poorly maintained and were rusting away in ports for the most part. So, in a sense, as soon as the Kursk had been built, it started to decay slowly due to neglect. By the end of the 90s, there was a tiny revival in finances allocated to the Russian Northern Fleet, and even the Kursk embarked on a reconnaissance mission to the Mediterranean, spying on an American fleet during the Kosovo War. But the real action for the Kursk in years would be on the 12th of August 2000. That was the date the so-called Summer X exercise commenced. It was supposed to be the largest naval exercise in over a decade of the Russian Navy, and the first large-scale naval exercise after the collapse of the Soviet Union. 30 ships and 3 submarines participated, including the battlecruiser Pyotr Veliki, Russian for Peter the Great. During the exercise, the Kursk submarine was tasked with attacking the ship. Thing is, the entire fleet was in an abysmal condition due to the decade of neglect. Obviously, a lot was at stake after such a long hiatus of the Russian Navy. But the exercise wouldn't just end up in a failure, but a catastrophic disaster, one of the largest in Russian maritime history. On the 12th of August at 11:25 a.m., the Kursk descended and kicked off the mission. On board were 112 men, 44 officers and 68 sailors. As the submarine descended, a test alarm alerted the sailors to fire a dummy torpedo at the flagship Peter the Great, and from the launch of this torpedo things rapidly went south. Now, during the exercise, the Kursk submarine used dummy torpedoes that were by this time controversial. Actually, that is an understatement. The torpedoes the Kursk used contained ingredients that had been considered fundamentally flawed since the 1950s, after the British Navy had several explosive accidents with them. The official reading of the disaster states that problems were caused by a fuel component that was part of a mixture necessary for a dummy torpedo that was going to be launched. See, the torpedo tube of the Kursk was made of copper, and, hydrogen peroxide, one of the controversial elements of the torpedoes, has an explosive reaction when it comes into contact with oxidizing metal. But in theory, if the launch of the torpedo went well, the contents of the torpedo would not get into contact with the tube. However, one of the torpedoes leaked due to a welding fault, which ironically wasn't noticed because it was a dummy torpedo. And a bit ironic as well, the fuel required for the launching of the torpedo consisted of more energy than the replaced warhead. As the torpedo was launched through the welding fault, the hydrogen peroxide came into contact with rust and corrosion. It sparked a rapid exothermic process. The heat increased, which led to an explosion. exactly the reason why NATO countries had not used these type of torpedoes for nearly half a century. So the inside of the hatch had an electrical connector which would check the torpedo before it was launched. This electrical connector had to be cleaned every so often, and convinced that they had to clean it again, the crew decided not to fasten the clamps as they closed the hatch. This literally resulted in the explosion blast, which was roughly equal to 100 kilograms of TNT directed completely inwards with full force. The explosion was powerful to the degree that it reached the adjacent area where the captain and 36 officers, together with several sailors, were. The blast caught them entirely by surprise. The first explosion left many dead and critically injured, with vital systems defunct, removing any chance of external communication. In Norway, a seismographic station, a station that measures earthquakes, is surprised at the rumble of 1.5 on the Richter scale. Following the explosion, the Kursk rapidly sank to 108 meters under the sea level and stranded there on the sandbank. But even worse, because the blast, hydrogen peroxide started flowing from the hatch into the submarine. Meanwhile, the heat of the first explosion raised the temperatures to nearly 400 degrees in the area. This was the critical temperature for spontaneous combustion of the torpedoes. And that is exactly what happened. It is estimated 5 to 8 torpedoes spontaneously combusted, which resulted in an explosion that was 250 times larger than the first one. The seismographs in Norway measured an earthquake that's 3.5 on Richter scale, a very unusual number. Even though the Kursk suffered 2 incredibly powerful explosions, there were still some survivors. The last explosion blew a large hole in the hull, and the first 3 compartments of the submarine collapsed. It killed everyone in these compartments, including the technician, but not before the technician managed to close the reactor room and switch off 2 nuclear reactors in time. This blast killed 89 other men on board. Many imploded and were burned or were killed by the water pressure. The explosion destroyed the panels between the compartments due to the water that seeped in with immense strength. Somehow the panels that protected the nuclear reactors didn't succumb to the water pressure though. All the way in the emergency rear compartment, 23 men were at this point still alive. It is unknown what happened in that compartment, but the investigation concluded that around 8 hours after the first explosion, the final survivors probably suffocated due to lack of oxygen and carbon monoxide poisoning. In total, the entire crew, all 118 of the submarine, died in the incredible tragic disaster. But what's perhaps even more curious than the disaster itself is its aftermath and the way it was managed by the Russian Navy and President Putin. Now, many other ships participated in the exercise, however. The other submarines did not realize that Kursk had crashed until 11 o'clock in the evening, nearly 12 hours after the facts. Kursk's commander, Gennady Lyachin, had failed to get in touch at the agreed-upon time of 5:30 p.m., and the next 5.5 hours of trying to establish contact with the submarine yielded no results. Half an hour later, at 11:30 p.m., an emergency situation was declared. A convoy of ships headed by the Northern Fleet commander Vyacheslav Popov sailed out the next morning to search for the missing submarine, and just before 5 a.m. the next day, the Peter the Great cruiser detected the Kursk at a depth of 108 meters, stranded on a sandbank at the bottom of the sea. Now, the rescue mission was filled with human errors and neglect. Eventually, it took 14 months to retrieve the remains of the Kursk. Initially, the Russian government tried everything to downplay the seriousness and cause of the disaster. Although other countries proposed that it would send aid, the Russians firmly rejected this. Vladimir Putin, who had been president for under a year by this point, was faced with his first serious disaster. So what did he do? Well, he resided in his summer home in Sochi during the incident and did not actually go to Murmansk until a week later, when the gravity of the situation became clear. It led to a lot of criticism both domestic and in other countries, and Putin ended up publicly apologizing twice for his handling of the situation. Due to built-in stealth measures, the wreckage of the Kursk was difficult to detect, and it took several days for divers to actually locate the wreckage properly. Russia didn't have the naval expertise to retrieve the wreck because of the stormy Barents Sea and the lack of adequate naval power. They ended up requiring foreign aid to do so. And eventually, the Russians approached 2 Dutch companies, Smith and Mammoet, but even for them the job was incredibly challenging due to the weather and the tumultuous sea. In April 2001, the contract between the Russian government and the Dutch companies was signed, but after October the sea would be too stormy to complete the mission. So there were only 5 months in order to salvage the wreckage. So in October the plan commenced. The front part of the Kursk would be sawed off since it was too heavy to lift up. Holes were bored in the hull in order to connect plugs that would, once they were inside the submarine, spring open and become somewhat of hoisting ropes. Disregarding the stormy weather, in an operation that took 15 hours, the retrieving of the Kursk wreckage became a success, 14 months after the initial disaster. The commanding officer of the Kursk, Gennady Lyachin, received the title Hero of the Russian Federation posthumously, and all crew members received the Order for Bravery. This rather recent event is still printed in the collective memory of many Russians, and it certainly was one of the things that could have tripped Putin up before he properly established his power base in Russia. Thank you very much for watching this video. I would also like to thank all my patrons for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and want to support my work, consider checking me out on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you will already gain access to the exclusive Patreon series. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.